So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
Welcome. It's Thursday, and it's not a practice Friday for most people. It is your Friday. So if you are making that drive home, and hey, maybe you're new to Trending because you've recently gone back to work. Welcome. I'm Timmer. I'm your host of Trending, and I'm so happy to be with you. Here on Thursdays, we have our weekly marriage hour, taking up difficult topics surrounding marriage, but also the fun ones too. And I think today's conversation can be really put within the context of the good news surrounding marriage and how sometimes when we get a little confused about what things such as permanence and fidelity mean, they can actually sometimes perhaps make us complacent. Here's a question I have for you. Does the attitude of fidelity and permanence going into marriage make you complacent? We'll be talking about how actress Megan Fox, known for her acting in the Transformers movie, and her husband, actor and 90210 star Brian Austin Green, are separating. And Brian had something really fascinating to me to say about how maybe his downfall had to do with his attitude going into marriage. So we'll unpack that. Not sure exactly what he meant, but it had to do with his attitude of marriage being for life. That's a good thing. But why did he consider it his downfall? If you're just joining us, go ahead and give us a call. The number's 1-888-914-9149. Again, that's 1-888-914-9149. You can always contact us via social media. You can check out my Instagram story where you're welcome to ask questions right there through the story. Just head over to relevantradio.com/trending to go ahead and connect on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. And guess what? My guest today is Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire. He's known for his show, The Michael Knowles Show, and we're going to talk about how marriage has changed him. He's been in the public eye, but not many know necessarily that he's also been married. He's still a newlywed of 2 years. And he has a lot to say not only about the challenges in our culture to marriage and how certain attitudes can get in the way, but how, again, marriage has changed his own life. Let's talk about this attitude of fidelity and permanence within marriage, though. I am, again, heartbroken here to the Transformer actress Megan Fox and her husband, Brian Austin Green, who are divorcing. Now, Brian Green has a well-known podcast where he ended up kind of giving this tell-all about the two of them separating. He said that he will always love her, and he's confirmed the split with Megan Fox after nearly 10 years of marriage and 3 children later. In fact, Green revealed that he began to feel distant from his wife, Megan Fox, late last year. Fox herself says last year while she was filming Midnight in Switchgrass that she herself started to feel more like herself and like a better version of herself, essentially, as she was traveling separated from her family and husband. Much could be said about that, but that's not what stands out to me. Here's what stands out. In fact, actor Brian Austin Green, Megan Fox's husband, said that his downfall was that both he and his wife had an attitude going into marriage that this choice was for life. He said, "This is somebody that I want to share the rest of my life with and have a family with." He said, "I think for me that might have been a bit of a downfall because I think I became too complacent." Hold up here. There are 2 interpretations I could take from this. First, that because he maybe assumed that marriage was for life, maybe he took his wife for granted. Maybe. But then the one that most news outlets are using, eHollywood, Access, I could go on, they're more so taking the approach that believing that marriage for life is essentially a fantasy. And that's a complacent outlook to have on life and marriage. And that really marriage isn't permanent, and you can kind of lose sight of who you are and what you really want. So I don't know exactly what Brian Greene meant, but I think that we can dissect this attitude a little bit here to maybe figure out how the current cultural understanding about marriage can be confusing. So first I ask this question: can you take for granted your marriage and your spouse or even your family and not necessarily work at it because you say, hey, I believe marriage is for life, marriage is permanent, we're called to be faithful to each other, we're called to be fruitful, I believe all of that. But then you get complacent, you make assumptions, and you don't work at it. I think that that's very easy to do, especially in a culture with prolonged single years. And in fact, I was looking at some statistics earlier this morning, and it talked about how if you marry over the age of 32, that for each year later you marry, your risk of divorce increases by 5%. Now, I think the reason for that is that the older we are when we marry, the more set in our ways we are, the less flexible and adaptable and willing we are to accept someone else and have that other person transform us. I mean, it's even written into our biology that we have children, at least for women, when we're younger, because we're more capable of caring for those children and adapting to the great responsibilities that these kids require. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Thanks for joining me. Go ahead and give us a call at 1-888-914-9149 or go ahead and comment on my Instagram story. Find my social media at relevantradio.com/trending. So another interesting perspective that we could talk about here is how, yes, you could take for granted your spouse. You could definitely, thinking that marriage is for life, allow things to fall into shambles. But at the same time, the culture also thinks that monogamy means complacency, that you're just settling, that there's always someone else out there who's better. You see, this is a problem with friendships that aren't virtuous, friendships that have to do with pleasure, and friendships that have to do with not just pleasure, but using the other person. In fact, Aristotle, the great philosopher who lived 300 years before Christ, came to a very basic understanding of the human person and our need for happiness that is directly connected to friendship and virtue, that we're social creatures. And so this attitude of non-monogamy in the culture, some people think that means that you're more free, you're more capable of loving. But a distinctly Christian understanding of the human person could argue that it actually brings you a deeper sense of satisfaction. In fact, there was a study done over the course of 70 years by Harvard. And what they came to understand is they were studying overall human satisfaction and happiness. And this is what they found. The people who were happier were people who had long-lasting relationships. And I'm not just going to say long-lasting relationships, but actually who were married for life, who were close to their children and grandchildren. You see, when divorce enters into the picture, that closeness to children and grandchildren isn't necessarily as strong. It actually decreases and breaks up families more than sometimes we're willing to admit. And it also separates you from that person that I think most people think they would have spent the rest of their lives with once they married. Now, it's interesting because as I continue to look at what the cultural narrative is surrounding marriage, the attitude of complacency just doesn't fit into what Christian marriage is, a sacramental marriage is. You see, if you go into marriage thinking that it's about being pleased and cared for and about your own happiness, sure, you will become complacent. You will likely become unhappy, and you'll most likely check out, and so will your spouse. But you see, I love St. John Paul the Great and the history of the church that we have, because if you really see into a distinctly Christian and sacramental understanding of marriage, you come to understand that actually marriage is connected to redemptive suffering. That's right. Marriage is redemptive suffering. Any married person right now could be laughing hysterically because the truth of the matter is marriage is difficult. At times, it could be considered miserable. But you have two options here. You could say, okay, well, I believe marriage is for life, so I'm just going to embrace the suck. Or you could have the attitude that marriage is going to be challenging. And those challenges are going to transform me and edify me, make me a better person, and teach me how to love in a way that I never believed I could. I love talking to people who have been married for years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 70 years. They're still out there. And one of the fascinating things that I notice the husband often says is that he'll say, I didn't know that I could love my wife more today than I did on the day that I married her. Because he's learned how to love. Redemptive suffering is real, and if you question it, just look at the example that Jesus Christ set. He said in Matthew 20, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And in fact, if we look through the various epistles of the church, we read especially in 1 Peter that man is called to follow in Christ's suffering and to be made worthy through this suffering. St. Peter, the first pope, said this, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer various trials. And then in fact, St. Peter goes on to talk about specifically Christian spouses and about how, in fact, it's in marriage that you can win a spouse over who doesn't believe in Christ by the way you interact with them, even if they're not living a very Christ-like life. That's a challenge for you and I to change our attitude when we're in marriage. Joining me today to talk about how marriage has transformed his own life and also to discuss some of the greatest risks with regard to marriage, not just topical kind of issues, but more so attitudes that we've allowed these cultural issues to influence us in various ways. My guest is Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire, host of the Michael Knowles Show. Michael, thanks for joining me today.
Well, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for fitting us in. I'm excited to unpack, especially to talk about how your recent marriage, you're newlywed as well. You got married in 2018, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Yes, so I'm looking forward to talking about how that's changed you and kind of changed your sense of responsibility and understanding of yourself. But let's go ahead and talk about how marriage has essentially changed your identity and responsibility and how it's maybe kind of shifted that identity in a way that the culture likes to define, like sexuality has to do with identity, especially same-sex attraction. But from a Catholic perspective, we understand that a sacrament actually does influence and transform our identity and sense of responsibility. So what's changed for you?
Well, as you mentioned, sometimes you talk to people who've been married for 20 or 40 years, and I have the vast experience of about 24 months of marriage, but it is transformative nevertheless. And interesting in this culture, too, because people used to get married much younger. They'd get married at 20, 21, 22. I got married at 28, which by today's standards, millennial standards, I was basically a child groom. You know, people are getting married so much later than they otherwise would have. Of course, I suppose we should expect this irony that in a culture that exalts sexual identity above most other identities, and certainly last month, which in the secular liturgical calendar is Pride Month, it sort of ignores marriage and it encourages people to put off marriage. And the reason it does this in the way that it entices many people, many Catholics, to put off marriage is it says that you will lose some of your freedom. I have one regret with regard to my marriage, which is I wish I had done it much sooner. I could have done it much sooner. My wife and I met for the first time in middle school, of all things. And but the culture just told us not to, and we sort of took that for granted. And what I've realized is that when you get married, this is not a cutting short of your freedom, but rather it is bringing yourself into public life. We've talked about politics a little bit, and I talk about politics a lot on my show. Marriage is a sacrament, and then in the civil society, it is a political act. It is a public act saying that I am willing to mature and move on with the next stage of my life in the building block of society, which is the family. It's not the atomized individual. It is the family. And in the same way that we misunderstand liberty in this culture as something we're born with that gets taken away when we have rules put upon us, the Christian understanding of liberty is that we are born as slaves to our passions, slaves to our appetites, and only through education and growth do we master those appetites and become truly free. That's why we have the phrase liberal education. And the same is so clearly true with marriage. Only after we move beyond the adolescent stage, and perhaps you could take holy orders, perhaps you could become celibate, or perhaps you could enter into marriage. Whatever you do, that is a maturation, that is a next stage of life. But unfortunately, so many people in today's culture are stuck in perpetual adolescence, and I think it explains some of the madness on the social front that we've seen for the past few weeks.
That is so true, Michael. If you're just joining us, that's Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. Michael, you mentioned that perhaps there was some delay in your own marriage. Did you and your wife date? Are you high school sweethearts, dating from middle school?
Yes, we were. We didn't date from middle school. That would have been a little bit too young. Talk about child brides. But we did date in high school. And then, like all millennials, we were told that you've got to split for college. I mean, it's so funny because a generation or two past, they would have said, you got to get married, true love will last forever. And yet, when we were in high school, we were told, oh, that's crazy. You got to split up. You got to see other people. Forget about that kind of craziness. And so we split up. And then 3 or 4 years of college later, I came to my senses and chased my high school sweetheart back, and we began dating again. But even at that point, we were putting off marriage because, well, one, I for much of that period of time, I would have called myself an atheist or an agnostic. My wife was not Catholic, and so we weren't taking these religious questions very seriously. But for the other reason is the reason I think most people think of today, which is we were putting our careers first. A graduate school for my wife, for me, my work in politics and show business. And now people are told, put your careers first, get a stable career, and then maybe get married in, your 30s or 40s. And a lot of people are doing that, but I think you're seeing quite a lot of regret because it doesn't have to be an either or. When you give yourself to somebody else, that doesn't mean that you're going to take away from your own professional accomplishment. Actually, what we're beginning to learn is that to have a full life, you actually do have to give yourself over and not make everything just about your own selfish desire. And actually, only then will you achieve your fullest potential.
Michael, what was your wake-up call that led you to chase back down your high school sweetheart?
Well, I joke about this. Apologies to any girls who went to Yale out there, that there's nothing like 3 years of Yale girls to send you screaming back, arms outstretched to your high school sweetheart. Maybe a little mean to my classmates in college.
There's some very bitter career women out there right now.
I think that is the case. I mean, you just
bring
saw
the emails for that comment.
I know. Well, it is interesting because, especially in college, the way that college is set up these days, we are taught that you have to prioritize yourself above all things, that relationships ought to be fleeting and on your own terms. I didn't graduate from college all that long ago, and I still have some friends who are in the universities. And what is clear is gone. A semblance of a serious committed relationship is mostly gone, and actually all that one has is the hookup culture, which is so corrosive to people and has effects that last long after they leave the campus.
Michael, why did your attitude then change about marriage? You mentioned then kind of having delayed getting married. You guys were focusing on your careers, various education, and then all of a sudden there's something that changed. Because, 28 years old, although young in the culture's eyes, it's still a little bit of a delay in terms of the Catholic view of marriage. Where did the shift happen?
Oh, yeah. Well, the reverting to the church was certainly helped that along, and that really only happened, I don't know, probably 23 or 24 years old around that time. And then there were questions of who's going to get into this graduate school and who's got this job here. So it was a little bit of a geographical issue as well. And then looking back on it, though, I mean, 28 years old, so we got engaged at 26, 27. Looking back on it, we could have gotten engaged at 18, for goodness sakes, or certainly right after college. And I think what began to dawn on me, both socially or politically, as well as religiously and spiritually, is that so much of what we are being told is simply not true. If the popular culture is wrong about the nature of the human person, if the popular culture is wrong about how to pursue one's career, if the popular culture is wrong about social values, if the popular culture is wrong about everything, just about, then probably it's wrong about marriage too. And if I could convey anything to your listeners or to my listeners, I would convey that sort of skepticism of the popular culture, so that people can realize it's wrong, hurry up, get on with their lives, and then move on to the next wonderful thing, rather than remaining in perpetual childhood.
When people are finally ready to make that plunge, and hopefully sooner than they think, rather than following the cultural narrative. Not that there won't be risks and challenges along the way. Of course, we want to encourage responsibility. But how do you think people, when they do finally make the plunge to get married, shake off attitudes of inflexibility within marriage that's maybe been fueled because of these prolonged single years that's bred complacency even within the relationship?
Sure, I think that can be a big issue, and I think just the problem of selfishness can be a big issue, because everything in our upbringing, and frankly, this is true even for people who haven't strayed from the faith, is largely pointing us toward a certain selfishness. So I think one thing that's very important, particularly in this culture, is recognizing the absolute social wreckage that we are walking around in. I mean, these days in the United States, we're walking around in literal wreckage because buildings are being burned to the ground and statues are falling down and that sort of thing. But on a spiritual level, that is all the more so. And I think people have a lot of hang-ups and a lot of baggage because maybe they did some things in college that they oughtn't to have done, and maybe they've had some relationships that they oughtn't to have had, and maybe they've made plenty of mistakes that have been made easier by the popular culture. And so I think that as well is causing people to put things off. But one important thing to consider here is the matter of grace, the matter of repentance, and how we can begin again. We can simply turn away from that sort of thing. And if you mire yourself too much on some of those either past mistakes or the present social condition, then you're not going to be able to move forward with your life.
Michael, we've been talking about various attitudes surrounding marriage and delaying marriage, but what do you believe are the top 2 threats to living out a faithful and fruitful marriage today, and why?
There's no question that internet pornography is probably the most widespread threat. And I think by some measures it's something like 91% or 92% of American men look at pornography, and 8% are liars. Especially if you were to say, perhaps not as an ongoing problem, but as something that people have done in the past. It is everywhere. It is just the entire culture. The whole internet is soaked in it, and one can do it, from the privacy of whatever dark corner of one's house there is. So that is an issue that I think has to be confronted at a personal level and has to be confronted at a political level, because there is no question in my mind that it's making marriage, which is already difficult in this culture, even harder. Then on a less particular level, I think there is this problem of wanting to have it all. I won't mince words here in my views of modern feminism and other gender theories. I think it's just simply a recipe for misery. You can look, since the advent of what's called the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, women's happiness has declined precipitously, both in relative terms and absolute terms. This is a problem. It's because of a false understanding of human nature that views men and women as identical rather than what they really are, which is complementary.
We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmery with Michael Knowles, and I'll have a couple resources to help remedy these threats to marriage.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Give us a call with your questions. Our toll-free line is 1-877-914-9149 and is sponsored by Charity Mobile, the pro-life phone company. Joining me today is Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show, heard on the Daily Wire. And we were just speaking a moment ago about what he believes the top 2 threats are to living out faithful and fruitful marriages in today's culture. And he mentioned internet pornography, with over 90% of men looking at pornography, and 2, this attitude of wanting to have it all, especially for women. And so 2 resources I want to throw out there before we move on is Covenant Eyes. CovenantEyes.com is an excellent filtration software for people looking to start with making that first step in weeding porn out of their lives. You need accountability partners. And the truth is, a porn addiction is a sex addiction, and we need both faith and prayer and real therapy and intervention. Second, wanting to have it all is a real threat, and there was an excellent book published last year by Dr. Carrie Gress, and it's called The Anti-Mary Exposed, and how much of today's attitudes about women actually is very anti a Christian attitude about women. And it challenges us to rethink attitudes about marriage, sexuality, and even just domestic life. So those are a couple resources I would mention. Michael, I'd like to dive in more so to the topic about how marriage has changed you. But first, I have a question. Being a newlywed of 2 years as well, I'm married a year, people often told me entering into marriage that first year of marriage was going to be awful and to buckle up. I didn't find that the case, and I'm wondering what your experience was.
No, I very much enjoyed it. You know, I suppose that because I, like many millennials, I suppose, did things a bit in the wrong way and put off getting married and all that sort of thing, that unlike many newlyweds, my wife and I had known each other for quite some time, you know, since we were children. So there wasn't so much of that getting to know each other much more deeply period. Really what it was a giving over of oneself completely. And this would be, I suppose, a third major threat to marriage today, which is that it's just not permanent for so many people in the culture. For us Catholics it is, ideally, though of course there are many civilly divorced Catholics as well. That when you enter into that marriage expecting that it just won't work out or it might not work out, then your chances of it not working out are significantly higher. Whereas, as you said earlier, if you go in and you say, we're in this, pal, you know, we are in this together, then it is more likely to, because you won't get divorced. I asked a few people before I was getting married for advice. I said, how do you stay married for so long? And they said, it's very simple. You don't get divorced. And that's pretty good advice, I think. And it's simple, but sometimes the simplest advice is some of the best. And so that's one issue, is just not being on the same page. And then this comes down to the roles of husbands and wives as well, because husbands don't want to be husbands and wives don't want to be wives. I went to a wedding once with, this was years and years ago, and there were a couple of, I think they were ex-nuns, and they decided to rewrite some of the book of Genesis and take out all the language about, you know, wives being subservient to their husbands and husbands loving their wives. They felt that wasn't very feminist, so they got rid of that sort of thing. And I thought, you know, I don't think you're setting this marriage off on a very nice foot if you're rewriting the words of God. Probably that's not something that I would do in my wedding.
It is so true. I think that, you know, this kind of erasing of what is feminine and what is masculine has kind of dumped us into a new marriage state, and we go, I don't really know how to act, how to interact in this new relationship. I have a question for you I'd like to throw your way. One thing I noticed in my own journey, because my husband and I dated for much longer than either of us would have liked, and delayed marriage somewhat as well. And one of the things that really helped me along through the journey is working within various Catholic and pro-life apostolates. And it helped for me to keep this attitude of, we are created as human beings to serve and to give our lives in service. And my attitude was, I'm not married. I can stretch myself more because I don't have this type of marital relationship. And I've heard a lot of people say when talking to singles that this attitude of remembering to serve during your single years can really help you in having a better attitude entering into marriage and working toward virtue when those difficulties arise. What are your thoughts?
That's an excellent point. You know, it is in many ways about the other person. And the way that this expresses itself, by the way, is not always in, just constantly deferring to the other person and, making yourself into a doormat. I mean, that's not what we're talking about at all, even though I think many millennials might think that is the case. Actually, sometimes the thing that you don't want to do is make a decision. I'm reminded this often happens with my wife. We'll say, okay, we're going to go out to dinner. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go? I don't know what you want. Do you want Italian? I don't know about Italian. We'll go back and forth for maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then finally, she'll come to her senses and she'll say, hey, head of household, make a decision. What's wrong with you? And I thought, oh, yes, you're right. Here is a role in a marriage that could be so simple as picking a restaurant. But people ought to do that sort of thing. And I think that's an important aspect of service, is doing the things that you don't necessarily want to do. Doesn't always look the way that you might expect, but it's very important. And when we're receiving such backwards messages from the popular culture, it can be a hard lesson to learn.
You're listening to Trending with Timmery. That's Michael Knowles of The Michael Knowles Show, heard on the Daily Wire. Michael, what have you learned from being married that you didn't really expect?
What I've learned from being married is, I knew a lot about my wife, though I've learned quite a lot more about my wife as well. I've relearned a lesson that seems so simple, which is that either you will grow together or grow apart. And we're not just merely isolated individuals, moving on our own path, but really this building block of society, this family, is going to define your life. I mean, you are going to grow in different ways because of your marriage. That's very important. And then one thing I learned that I suppose I doubted, or maybe I just wasn't particularly interested in during those atheistic single years, is how conducive marriage is to virtue. It seems so simple. It's a sacrament. It's what we're sort of made to do, in the words of Christ. And yet I think people forget about that. And many of one's vices, whatever those vices may be, I won't get into specifics, but I think across the whole range of vices, can be greatly allayed, can be really diminished simply by the institution of marriage. There is just something about when a single guy gets married, his wife civilizes him, and maybe for a young women tend to be a little more anxious than young men. And getting married can calm them a little bit. And I'm just scratching the surface of that. It seems so obvious, and yet in a crazy culture, obvious things are not always so clear.
And it's a very profound statement you just said about that civilization of the man in marriage and that calming of the woman in marriage. It's very fascinating. And, we often make the joke in our culture, well, that's what sex does. But I don't think that's the case. It's the challenge and complementarity of femininity and masculinity, not just on a sexual complementarity, but from the level of who you are and the fact that we function so differently as men and women.
Right. This is one lesson that anybody who's a newlywed will know, is that men and women actually are different. I know that we live at a time where we're told that men can be women and women can be men and there's no difference at all. I think anyone who's a newlywed will know that is simply not the case.
That is very true. Maybe that's the reason so many people are so confused. They're not having children. They're not getting married to experience anyone outside of themselves, to see that we actually function quite differently. Michael, last question here. What was the significance for you of marrying in the Catholic Church?
Oh, it was just, it's essential, and at the time that we were married, I had just reverted a few years earlier. My wife was not raised in the faith, and so in a way it was a little bit new to us. And
for a second there.
But it was so essential. When I think back to the wedding, we got to do it at the Church of St. Michael in New York with our great friend Father George Rutler, and so often modern weddings are just about the bride and the groom kissing, and it's very sentimental and saccharine. But when you go through it really as a sacrament, and you realize it's almost not even about you two. It's about this sacrament before the presence of God, often facing away from the congregants and toward the altar. And when you point that focus not merely on yourselves and your own union, but actually what that union means in the presence of God, it clarifies things.
Thank you for being with us, Michael. That's Michael Knowles of The Michael Knowles Show, talking about how marriage has changed him and what some of the greatest threats are in this current culture. We'll be coming back and diving more into the sacrament of marriage and why marrying in the church really does matter.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back to the show. It is great to be with you. Thanks for driving with us, jogging with us, or taking us on your 3-day weekend, whatever you might be doing. I just want to remind you that you don't have to miss a single episode of Trending. If you just head over to relevantradio.com/trending, you can not only find the full archive of episodes, but you can also go and subscribe to your favorite show here, of course, Trending, on your favorite podcasting apps. We're on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and others, so go check them out. And of course, you can always catch all of our episodes at the Relevant Radio app for your smartphone as well. So it's our marriage hour every Thursday, and if you have a question about marriage, go ahead and let us know. Give us a call on the show or write in. We'd love to hear from you. I want to wrap up today's show, though, talking about the sacrament of marriage. You see, I think a lot of people are struggling right now with regard to the permanence and fidelity of marriage, specifically because we live in a culture of legal marriages, courthouse documentation, and fast 5-minute-long ceremonies. And I have to tell you, there's a richness to the Catholic tradition. There's a richness to the fact that you are entering into a sacrament. Now, I have to tell you, growing up, I had really only been to Catholic weddings. Now, as I kind of started to come out of high school and some of my friends started getting married, I started to be exposed to non-Catholics getting married. And I have to tell you, I was shocked. It was a cultural shock for me to see what marriage looked like outside of the church. And here was the most shocking thing. The sacrament was missing often. The celebration, the understanding that we are entering into an exchange of persons that's permanent, meant to be fruitful, meant to be faithful, meant to be total, meant to be entered into freely, that was often missing because of the way we've reduced marriage to a courthouse wedding. To even the fact when we throw out the nice clothes, where we no longer honor the occasion with the way we dress, even with the way we celebrate and party, to be quite frank. I think that's one of the challenges I actually feel for a lot of the people who I admire who are choosing to get married during this quarantine. That they're recognizing, especially within the church, that the sacrament is what's most important. And yes, the party is a great celebration of the sacrament and support for those spouses, but that ultimately a marriage before God is what they want and what they hunger for. because graces come with the sacrament of matrimony. So let's talk a little bit about some of the fruitfulness we can understand comes from the sacrament of marriage. You see, the sacrament of marriage is ordered for two purposes that I'm sure we know as Catholics: for the good of the spouses and for the procreation and education of children. Which means if you're entering into this and you don't hope to love your spouse, to help get your spouse to heaven, if you don't want children, if you don't plan on raising them in the faith, then Catholic marriage isn't for you. That's not what marriage is. And unfortunately, we have a watered-down version of marriage in the institution we see implemented by the state. There's a big difference here that we need to learn from. You see, we can understand these two basic elements of the good of the spouses and the fruitfulness they're called to with children just in the first books of the Bible. Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Right there, written into both the human anthropology of the human person created by God, but also the spiritual dimension. We're told to be fruitful and multiply, and that the two shall become one flesh. Now, we often think about this one flesh in terms of a physical union of the two persons, male and female, which, might I add, is only possible with male and female. It's the only way it functions correctly. Can I just say this? Because I have to explain this to most people under the age of 35, okay? Just like the gas pump goes in the correct place, just like the seatbelt has a proper function, so too does the human body. And when it doesn't function that way, increase in sexually transmitted diseases by body parts going in places that they don't work together, increase in many, many health issues, and actually a decrease in fidelity, a decrease in lifelong satisfaction and happiness, an increase in mental health issues. That's all there when we divorce ourselves from the natural, physical, biological, physiological complementarity of male and female. So in case that wasn't cleared up, I'll get back to my point here, that in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we see be fruitful, multiply, but that the two shall become one flesh. Again, this isn't just having to do with our anatomy. The two becoming one flesh also has to do with the union of the persons for the good of the spouses. You see, I think one of the greatest challenges in marriage is not just giving love to the other person, but receiving the other person. Someone said to me a number of years ago that generosity doesn't just have to do with what we give to others. It has to do with how we receive from others. Now, I think that this is true because a lot of the time when we receive things, we can be ungrateful, uncomfortable. And you see, it's easier to receive things. It's easier to receive acts of service done toward us. But you know what's really difficult? To receive and accept a person. Think about it. We often hear so many parents who are struggling with the lives their adult children have chosen to live. Many parents who say, you know what, I'll just acquiesce. I'll go with you. I'll go there. Other parents don't know how to handle the adverse lifestyles their children are living. But in reality, you're called to accept and love a person. That doesn't necessarily mean approval of their behavior and acts. And we need to be able to communicate that better. How do you communicate that to your loved ones? That there's unconditional love present. You see, this two becoming one flesh, we're called to and challenged by in a very unique way within the sacrament of matrimony. A full acceptance and reciprocity of the other person, one to the other. You see, the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about how marriage isn't just a human institution. It's actually written into our very nature. This is why when we hear about courthouse weddings or these, fast Vegas weddings, they make sense from the perspective that it's written into our bodies, that's been ordained with a purpose by God. But if God created us for one another, male and female, he also created us to function in a particular way within those marriages. And so this well-being of the individuals in society is actually directly tied into the human person and our ability to love and be loved. For married love and family, society is impacted by it. And if you notice all of this chaos in our culture at this time, I think we have to admit that indeed, not just religion, but in fact social sciences show that when you take the father out of the home, the children suffer. When you produce single mothers, that children, although loved greatly, still need a father. There are so many pieces of information that show that divorce, the breaking up of a family, really does impact the child for the long term. But you see, Jesus affirms what Genesis chapter 2 says about the two becoming one flesh when he's speaking in Matthew chapter 19. We know that we're called to work toward this union of persons and to be fruitful and mutually educate children. This is what marriage is about. Yet the cultural narrative says, no, it's about your pleasure. It's about having it all. It's about choosing everything in your own timing, when in fact timing's quite the lie, especially when our biological clocks truly are ticking and reproductive sciences can't do everything. And you see, after the fall, marriage became more difficult. Genesis chapter 3 on, marriage became quite the beast. Because you see, we have a fallen nature. Sin entered in. Selfishness, self-esteem, confusion about our purpose was all of the aftermath of the fall of the human person that started in the garden. You see, read Genesis chapter 1. It will tell you a lot about human nature and about marriage. My sister, when she got married, was advised by her priest who did the marriage prep that she and her husband should go through and read the stories of each of the spouses and how things played out when they didn't agree with each other or compliment each other. What happened? Look, for example, at Abraham and his wife and others. You see, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that marriage helps to overcome self-absorption, egoism, pursuit of one's own pleasure, and to open oneself to the other, to mutual aid and self-giving. You see, the sacrament is a visible sign of a great reality of God's grace working in our lives. But it's also a mystery. This is one of the things I really do admire about the Eastern Church. That the Eastern Church, the Catholic Church, in fidelity with the Pope, refer to their sacraments as mysteries. Because yes, there's a physical sign of the body and blood of Jesus Christ under the veil of bread and wine. But there's also a great mystery in the transubstantiation. There's a mystery in the coming of Christ at Christmas and the incarnation. There's a mystery within the paschal sacrifice of Christ on the cross and how this mysteriously brings about our salvation. You see, God is working in spouses, in the sacrament of marriage, to bring about the graces necessary. In fact, we're challenged as spouses to help one another to attain holiness in our married life and to welcome the education of children. This is what the Catechism encourages us to. But it also states that Christ is the source of this grace and that he dwells with us and gives us the strength to take up our crosses and to follow him, to rise again after we have fallen, to forgive one another, and to bear one another's burdens, and to be subject to one another out of reverence to Christ, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love.